Welcome back to the last module in Unit 1 on Socrates. Before we delve into the Apology, I thought we'd cover a couple of key concepts from throughout the dialogues in the Republic as we're going into the module right before our unit assessment. So the first concept is the Socratic method, also known as the Elenchus. So remember, this is the main method Socrates is going to use to ask questions to test a claim or to reach a new conclusion. So an individual would make an assertion, and then Socrates would come up with a scenario or even a hypothesis to show weaknesses in that claim or to test it. And then that, through questioning, that original assertion would be amended. And then eventually Socrates would either refute their claim or state a new truth. So in this point, we see that hypothesis is going to be a key tool that Socrates used. So we saw this especially in Meno, where he would put forward a statement like, let's test to see if virtue is teachable. And then through a series of questions or scenarios, reach to see whether that hypothesis is true or not. We also saw in Meno the concept of theoretical knowledge, this belief that there's knowledge that is possessed prior to birth because the soul is considered to be immortal, and that we can recollect this theoretical knowledge, what's called the theory of recollection, by asking the right questions. We see this depicted in the math equation in Meno. And this all points to the theory of forms in the Republic, in which there's this belief in this realm of the forms, of ultimate forms, such as beauty, courage, and justice, that we can maybe perceive in some way, shape, or form through the visible world, but ultimately can only be attained beyond the visible world. And so this idea of the forms governing existence or guiding existence, so to speak, and us trying to attain it is really what the allegory of the cave is about, trying to move beyond perception into reality, into attaining the forms. Well, how do we move from seeing the shadows on the walls of the cave to moving past the fire to moving out of the cave? That would be the use of hypothesis and the use of the Socratic method, asking questions, testing knowledge so as to reach new truths. That's really the crux of what Socrates taught. So we're going to see in his apology, it's not him apologizing, it comes from the Greek word apologia, which means defense of. Socrates really giving a defense for his life's work, for his life's mission. So the apology is the culmination of all these dialogues and of the thoughts Socrates has put forward in the Republic. So background, why is he giving a defense? Well, Socrates has been arrested and put on trial. Why has he been put on trial? Well, we'll see in a second exactly all the claims against him, but in particular it's that he's corrupting the Athenian youth from believing in the Greek deities, or at least that's the claim that's put against him. And so he has to stand trial in front of a group of jurors. This is what he refers to as the men of Athens. Whenever he talks about the men of Athens in the Apology, he's referring to the court. And the court was of jurors was about a couple hundred individuals. So this is a large crowd that Socrates is speaking to. And they have his life in his hands. And so it would be pretty typical that when an individual came before the jurors, they would beg for the court's mercy. They would give money. They would give pleas. They would throw themselves on the court's mercy. They would bring relatives into the court to speak on their behalf. Socrates doesn't do any of this. If anything, he's kind of indignant and a little even pompous. Why? Because he sees his mission of seeking wisdom as the most important thing. And he's not going to go against that. He's not going to deny what he knows to be true to get himself out of the cave, so to speak, in that allegory of the cave, just to escape death. And we're going to see what he means by that there are worse outcomes than simply death. And really what we're going to see in the Apology is not only his refutation of the claims in a very typical Socratic manner, but also his defense of philosophy. If philosophy is the search for wisdom, he's really defending the right to engage in philosophical inquiry. That if he is condemned for simply just doing that, asking questions and entering into dialogues in order to seek truth, then if that's illegal, then what is the point of philosophical inquiry? But it is only through philosophical inquiry, through the seeking of wisdom, that we'll actually come to know truth, that we'll actually seek happiness. And remember, through all the other dialogues, that was a key point of question. What is virtue? What is virtue teachable? What is excellence? What is honorable? These are all very important to the early Greeks because it all was pointing to the answering the question of what leads to a good life. What is the good life? What is a life of happiness? For Socrates, you can only find that out through philosophical inquiry. So he's defending the right to seek wisdom that he sees personified in his own mission and endeavor. So who are we going to see in this dialogue? You're going to see Socrates, who does a vast majority of the talking, even more so than the other dialogues. You're going to hear of his accusers, Miletus, Anytus, and Iacon. But Miletus is going to be really the only individual that he speaks to, the antagonist in the conversation. The jurors, the men of Athens. And he's going to reference Socrates' friends, including Plato. This is the one time that we hear of Plato actually being on the scene. And so we believe Plato to be a disciple or a follower of Socrates. But this is also a moment in where we think Plato inserts himself into the story. So the Apology can be thought of as three separate speeches from Socrates. The first speech is the longest, and in your version of the Apology, it's going to span pages 22 to about towards the end of 39. And you'll notice when they end, because there will be a statement in brackets. So for instance, at the end of the first speech, you'll see a statement where it says, the jury now gives the verdict of guilty and Miletus asks for the penalty of death. That's the end of the first speech. Really, it takes the form of a monologue, Socrates orating or speaking to the court. And he's going to name his accusers, including his main accuser, who he believes wrote the charge, Miletus. And he defines the accusations against him. We're going to see it specifically on page 29 and page 31. And the first main accusation against him, and he's questioning Miletus to get him to say exactly what he means, is that they believe that Socrates has corrupted the Athenian youth through his teachings. And what do we mean by that? They're claiming that to be an honorable Greek young man who supports society, who supports the Republic, is to uphold those Greek values. And part of those Greek values is the belief in Greek deities, Greek gods. And so they're claiming that through his teachings, he's confusing them, corrupting them, using good words to convince them of bad teachings that leads them away from the values of Greek society, leads them away from believing in the Greek deities, and so really will be in their fear, the rotting of Greek society. Well, obviously, Socrates says this isn't true, and these are just trumped up charges that his accusers are bringing up against him, mainly because they're upset that he has proved them wrong in their teachings. So he'll dispel certain straw man arguments against him, such as that he charged for his teachings, like the sophist. He says, well, how could I have charged for the teaching if I'm poor? If I'm poor, I didn't make any money, so clear I didn't charge for these teachings. And we'll get into some of the other arguments in a second that he uses to denounce these teachings. But really, you're going to see throughout these questionings that he has against Miletus and against the charges is his defense lies around his quest for wisdom. He didn't corrupt any youth, but rather questioned those who had wisdom, only to find out that they didn't have wisdom. And that's really why he believes they're actually mad at him, because he proved them to be unwise individuals, or at least pompous individuals. So here's an excerpt from the Apology on page 26. He says, after a long consideration, I at last thought of a method of trying the question. So the question he's referring to is he went to what was called the oracle at Delphi. And so oracles in ancient Greek world, we believe that there were women, individuals who the deities or gods, one of them being Delphi, spoke through and gave them prophetic wisdom or knowledge of something to come. And people would consult the oracles to try to tell the future. And so he went to the oracle at Delphi and asked him who was the wisest person. And the oracle at Delphi said that there was none wiser than Socrates. Well, of course, Socrates questions this, and he said the only way I could refute the question of the oracle at Delphi was to in fact find someone wiser than him to prove the oracle wrong. So when he began to find individuals who were considered to be brilliant and to talk to them, he really found out that they didn't know what they were talking about at all. That although many individuals thought them to be smart, they actually weren't at all. Now, while this sounds pretty terrible, he's saying this to prove a point about what true wisdom actually is. And he says, well, after questioning this individual who everyone thinks was smart, to find out only that they weren't smart, he decides that it's better off that Socrates himself uh, to be in the situation he is, because Socrates doesn't think he knows anything. Now, I know that sounds silly, but Socrates always thought that the search for wisdom was ongoing. So he says, better for me, who doesn't think that I know anything, but I know that I don't know anything, better me to be that way than for someone to think they know everything when in reality they don't really know anything at all. It's a false ignorance. And so what Socrates is really talking about is a self-awareness of true wisdom comes from not believing you know everything. True wisdom comes from a self-awareness of realizing what you don't know. And in that way, wisdom can be equated to a humility of being aware of our perceptions, how they're lacking, so that way we keep seeking for more wisdom. And in this, we start seeing Socrates' love for wisdom, that it's an ongoing process. And so in this moment, this is a great example of what Socrates meant by the allegory of the cave. The allegory of the cave would be an example of the pursuit of wisdom. And Socrates said, well, basically, you could compare these sophists who considered themselves to be wise, just like the men shackled. If you think back to the allegory of the cave, the men shackled to the wall, who see the shadows on the wall, and think if someone told them that those things weren't really what they were, that those people were crazy, that they knew exactly what those shadows were. But of course, we know in the allegory of the cave that those individuals don't know what the shadows were. That because they were shackled to the wall, they were in prison. They couldn't seek true wisdom. It's only the individual who becomes unshackled and ascends out of the cave and actually outside that sees reality for what it is. So in this speech, Socrates is putting himself in the place of the man who gets unshackled and is able to leave the cave, and he sees reality for what it is. And he's putting these other sophists, Miletus, and these other individuals who claim to know what truth is, claim to be wise, but really aren't, in the opposite position, in the position of being those individuals who are still locked into the cave, but demand that they're right. So we see really quickly, Socrates is not concerned with what other people think of him. And this is going to be the important undertone of showing his love of wisdom, is that it doesn't matter your appearance, or if you upset people by questioning their wisdom. It's more important to not assume that you know the truth, so that way there's no barrier. A lot of times when we are set in our ways, we're set in our worldview, we know it all, we can't admit that we're wrong. Because to accept the new idea means that we admit that we didn't know everything, so we don't want to accept the new idea. And this is what Socrates says is really the biggest obstacle to wisdom. And so he's going to question, he's going to not care how he appears when he seeks wisdom, so that way he can actually attain it, so he can actually attain truth and wisdom. So ultimately, this is to show that the quest of wisdom, the seeking of excellence, virtue, and truth, all these questionings we've seen in the previous dialogues, is all part of this quest for wisdom, is more important and is what really brings happiness. All the other things that, at any cost, it's more important to seek wisdom at any cost, no matter what happens to you. Stylistically, an example of how he questions is a couple of examples I wanted to point you to as examples of how he questions to seek wisdom. It's really around this conversation with Miletus. So, for instance, on page 30 in your text, he questions Miletus on why he, Socrates, would corrupt someone. He says, "Think, you claim that I would corrupt the youth of Athens, but if I corrupt someone, that means they become evil. And if they become evil, then that means they might hurt me. So why would I corrupt someone if that means they might potentially hurt me? And clearly a wise person wouldn't want anyone to hurt them." And so this is an example of Socratic logic. If A equals B and B equals C, then C must equal A. If A equals B and B equals C, then C must equal A. If you're saying I'm going to corrupt youth, and corrupt youth meaning that I'm going to be hurt by them, and a wise person wouldn't ever want to be hurt, then obviously I wouldn't have corrupted them. That would be an example of Socratic logic in this conversation with Miletus. Similarly, Miletus questions him, and he questions him in return about not believing in Greek deities. Well, he talks about the spirits. And he says, well, in ancient Greece, spirits were believed to be sons of gods. And so Socrates clearly believes in spirits. And he says, Miletus, if I believe in spirits, and spirits are thought to be sons of God, then wouldn't that then mean I believe in the gods? So again, the Socratic logic. If one thing means another thing and another thing means another thing, then clearly there's a conclusion. So if you say I don't believe in the deities, I believe in spirits. Spirits are the sons of deities. Therefore, if I believe in spirits and they're the sons of deities, clearly I must believe in the deities. So he systematically disproves Miletus's claims. We see in here another example of the Socratic method, of the Socratic logic. But more often than not throughout this dialogue, we're going to see that he primarily uses this method rhetorically. He asks himself the question, and then he answers his own question in front of the court. Then we get to second and third speeches, which are much shorter. So the second speech in your text is only going to last about 2 pages. Even though Socrates gives this grand defense of himself, the jurors, the court, finds Socrates guilty. And so Miletus, as the main accuser, gets to ask for the penalty, and he asks for the death penalty, for Socrates to die. And in this, we see Socrates transitioning from a defense of the claims against him to more of a defense of philosophy. Because again, seeking wisdom, which is what philosophy is, was his mission. To be put to death for basically the work that he was doing is to try to put philosophy on trial. And so now we see Socrates almost acting like philosophy's lawyer. He's defending the act of philosophical inquiry, that philosophical inquiry and questioning is of the highest value to personal life and society. Because it's only through that that we move from perception of happiness, that shadow on the cave wall, to understanding what happiness actually is, moving out of the cave into the forms. And we see perhaps what is considered the most famous of Socrates' statements: an unexamined life is not worth living. And I'll read you the entire paragraph that's on page 41. He says, perhaps someone might say, but Socrates, if you leave us, will you not be able to live quietly without talking? In other words, Socrates could have thought of another penalty instead of the death penalty, and then tried to convince the court of why they should allow him to have a lesser penalty. So for instance, Miletus asked for the death penalty. Socrates could have gone to the court and said, just exile me. I will never come back to Athens ever again. And people probably would have let him do that because they wouldn't have to hear from him again. But he doesn't do that. Why? Because he's so convinced that he needs to explain that what his mission was right. He's so convinced of his mission that even to say that he was wrong when he knows he wasn't is he can't do that. And so he says, well, but Socrates, if you leave us, will you not be able to live quietly without talking? Now, he says, this is the most difficult point on which to convince some of you. In other words, why he can't just simply walk away and, say I'm sorry when he knows he isn't wrong. He says, if I say that it is impossible for me to keep quiet, because that means disobeying the God, the oracle of Delphi, who said he is the wisest. You will not believe me and will think I am being ironical. In other words, he's saying, if he says I'm going to stop saying that I'm the wisest, that I actually know what I'm talking about, so to speak, through my questioning, then that would be disobeying the oracle at Delphi that first said he was indeed the wisest. He says, on the other hand, if I don't say that, and if I say that it is the greatest good for man to discuss virtue every day, and those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, for the unexamined life is not worth living for men, you will believe me even less. And in this phrase, this is actually really Socrates' mission in a nutshell. What he's saying is, you're expecting me to defend myself based on what the Oracle of Delphi said, that I'm the wisest. But in fact, that's not true. What really is true, the real reason I've been doing all of this, the real reason I've been questioning Meletus, I've been questioning Protagoras and Meno and all these individuals and entering these conversations, is really because it's just a good thing for men, for individuals to question, to talk, to test ideas. Why? Because ultimately, to get to the good life, you have to examine your life. You have to question your life. The unexamined life is not worth living because the unexamined life is not seeking wisdom. The unexamined life is not seeking truth. It just stays where it is. It stays stagnant. When we don't take time to reflect on what motivates us and what we're doing for our actions, and if actually is leading us to truth and beauty and goodness, then we're just kind of living a meaningless life. We're living like robots. And that's Socrates' point, is you have to question, you have to engage in philosophical inquiry, you have to examine your life so that it actually is worth living. That's really his thesis statement. The unexamined life is not worth living. That's how much he loved wisdom. How much does he hold this in regard? Well, this is where he gets himself in a little trouble. In that time, Olympians, the Olympics, of course, originated in ancient Greece. The original Olympians who won would receive meals for the rest of their life. And he says, well, instead of asking for a lesser penalty, like just sending himself into exile, he says, well, the reward I really should be getting for aiding you all in seeking wisdom and seeking truth and asking questions is I should get the same reward as the Olympians. I should receive free meals for the rest of my life. Well, needless to say, this doesn't go over well with everyone who just thinks that he's now making fun of them. But that's just really how important he saw the seeking of wisdom. He really believed that philosophical inquiry really helped society, that when society engaged in these questionings for truth and beauty and goodness and the forms, that it becomes a better society. That's how much he found this to be important. Well, the jury convenes again, and sure enough, they vote to give him the death penalty. And even now, when he has the opportunity to throw himself at the mercy of the court, and his friends like Plato are there trying to dissuade him, and he even says as much that, if there was a bond he had to pay, that all his friends could pay it for him. But even then, to prove a point that he has friends who could pay his bail, he could pick lesser penalties for him to endure. To prove a point, he says, I'm not going to do any of this. I'd rather die than succumb to wickedness. And what does he say? He says on page 42 towards the end that he says, I may die, and you may live, but you continue living in wickedness, and the gods will decide which fate is worse, to die in wisdom or to live in wickedness. And it's his rhetorical way of saying that dying is better than living a life in wickedness, to living a life of wrong action, of not seeking wisdom, of not seeking truth. It is better to die than to not seek wisdom. And this is a perfect example of what we call philosophical eros. So eros, the Greek word for infatuation love, this intense love of being infatuated with an idea. Socrates was infatuated with wisdom. He was consumed by seeking truth, so much so that he would rather die than to deny the truth that he has discovered. And what we refer to this is called moral absolutism. Things are not relative. In other words, things are not just all opinion or perspective. That amidst all these opinions and perspectives, there actually are objective truths. There is such a thing as right, and there is such a thing as wrong. And that to live the good life, we must seek what is right, virtuous, honorable, excellent. And that what is wrong, cowardice, we see in this conversation with Protagoras, leads us away from the good life. And so because it was so key in ancient Greeks to seek the good life, then there was this strong sense for Socrates of moral absolutism that if we must seek the good life, then we must seek what is good, what is right, what is true. And so how do we find what that is? We question. We use the Socratic method. We seek wisdom. We use philosophical inquiry to get closer to the right and to the good. But once we know what the good is, once we know what is right, we cannot deny it. We cannot go against it. And so that is why, even though Socrates knew what he had to say to get out of the trial, what he had to say to be acquitted, he could have just cried and asked for mercy and said whatever he needed to say to get out of that courtroom, still believing what he wanted to believe. To him, that would have been going against moral absolutism. That would have been doing the wrong thing. That would have been wickedness. He would have denied himself. He would have denied who he was, everything he worked for. And that is an example of an examined life. So Socrates is put forward here by Plato in the Apology as the example of what an examined life looks like. Someone who has spent their life asking the questions, the right questions, of virtue and excellence, of meaning and purpose, like Socrates, and then when put to the test, it doesn't back down. They hold true to all of that, and that's an admirable thing. I mean, if we think about our own lives, that if we actually were so sure about what was right, that we'd be willing to die for it. That's a wonderful example of someone who has truly reached the truth. Now, let me be honest in saying, by no means is this an allowance of saying, all right, we need to be so dramatic as to say, well, we'll die for what we believe in this moment. Certainly, I'm not saying that at all. But it's an extreme example that Socrates and Plato use, and that Socrates ultimately does use, where he dies for it, to show how much we should hold wisdom in seeking truth, how high of a regard we should hold it. And so ultimately, being condemned to death and dying, condemned to death to dying, Socrates dies by drinking hemlock poison, and he is said to drink it in one big gulp, and not fearing death, because he knows that in death he'll be released from all this bureaucracy. He can exist amongst the forms and the truth that he actually sought after. It's very dramatic on his part, but it underscores this simple point, that if we're to follow Socrates' example, what we should do is follow his love for wisdom, that we should question, we should seek out those who are wise, question them so as to seek new wisdom, so as to seek new truth. And in doing so, we make our way slowly out of the cave, closer to the ultimate realities, the ultimate objective truths of truth, beauty, and goodness. That's our module for this week, and we'll see you next one after the assignments.